Imperial Germany was one of those ambitious empires. The Germans just united in the second half of the 19th century and gained vast respect from the rest of the continent and the world as a scientific and industrial superpower, racking up 20 Nobel Prizes between 1901 through 1918 alone, spanning the categories of medicine, chemistry, physics, and literature. The year before the outbreak of World War I, Imperial Germany also boasted the largest economy in continental Europe and placed only third behind the United States and the British Empire on the world scale. With a robust military and rapidly prospering home status, the German Empire was ready for even more success and power. And that is exactly what they would aim to take. 1914. The First World War erupts. Imperial Germany, a longtime ally of the Austro-Hungarian Empire since the establishment of the dual alliance in 1879, was quick to enter the conflict on August 1st with its declaration of war on Russia, and shortly dragged France into the dispute with a second declaration on August 3rd. Per the Germans' pre-established war plan, Russia was not actually a primary focus, and Germany instead invaded Belgium, triggering Great Britain to declare war on the Germans only one day after the second German declaration of war. This explosion of discord triggered the start of Imperial Germany's infamous Schlieffen Plan, which later earned its name from the prominent German Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen. This meticulous design had actually been devised almost a decade prior, and was meant to be a plan to win a large-scale war, particularly against the French Third Republic. The strategy was to cross through Belgium and Luxembourg instead of directly into France through its shared border with Germany, and create a decisive victory by attacking the French flank and rear. The offensive would be split into a right wing, center, and left wing. The German 1st, 2nd, and 3rd armies would make up the right wing, with the left wing consisting of the 6th and 7th armies, and the center rounding out the strike with the 4th and 5th armies. The assumption of the Germans was that this plan could be executed fairly quickly, in an estimated 6 weeks or so, and that the Russians would be slow enough in mobilizing their own troops that a smaller German defensive would be enough to hold off their eastern enemy in the meantime. In the case that the Schlieffen Plan worked exactly or well enough as expected, Imperial Germany's next move would be to execute the September Program, which was an even more extensive plan for German expansion. This second plan was created at the start of World War I by Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg's private secretary, Kurt Reitzler. This new set of goals established a bold plan for German expansion in and outside of the European continent, and would have been the start of immense growth for the empire. The September program was scheduled to go as follows. First, the Schlieffen Plan would result in a definitive victory for Germany, and France would be forced to give up chunks of their territory up north and along the Dunkirk coast. France would also pay war reparations totaling 10 billion German marks, in addition to paying off Germany's national debt, subsequently wrecking the French economy. Next, France would also be forced to destroy its own northern forts in an effort to partially disarm itself. Furthermore, Belgium would at minimum be annexed by Germany, or in another case, become a German vassal state, whilst also seceding certain eastern portions of its territory and providing military bases for Germany. Luxembourg would then become a member state of Imperial Germany. The Russian Empire's lands would be re-established with some buffer states, such as Poland and other territories in the east, being formed under German authority. Belgium, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Austria-Hungary, the buffer states, as well as potentially Sweden, Norway, and Italy, would create a new economic association completely dominated by the German Empire. Germany would massively expand its colonial power, particularly by seizing French and Belgian colonies in Africa, and aiming to gain a larger influence in the region than the British, while opting to not necessarily take any British possessions. Lastly, the Netherlands must voluntarily come into a closer union with Imperial Germany. In reality, what actually happened was more than a small disappointment for the Germans. Chiefly, the Schlieffen Plan failed. For one thing, the speed at which the Germans intended to advance on France was unobtainable, and the enemy forces put up a better fight than had been anticipated, which stalled the German troops even further. There was also mistakes made throughout the execution of the plan, and it finally resulted in a withdrawal. The strategy seems genius on paper, but ultimately flawed in actuality because it relied on perfect and unrealistic execution that simply could have not been achieved in the heat of war. The result of this failure meant that Germany was now unable to enact the September program and instead got the one thing they wished to avoid: a two-front war. The Russians had mobilized their troops more rapidly than the Germans planned for, which meant that they would be facing off with the one minimal army that had been left to defend Germany from the east. Troops from the west had to be diverted, and all of Imperial Germany's hopes of expansion were rapidly dissolving as they became deeply entwined in an uphill battle that they had expected to avoid. The quick victory that the Germans had planned for was now a dream of the past, and so was the September program. This wasn't the German Empire's first time failing to obtain a goal they had set for expansion and conquest, though. Kaiser Wilhelm II made plans to invade the United States back in 1897 through 1903. Even if this plan was unrealistic, his goal in this instance was not necessarily to conquer the United States, but instead to weaken the country economically and politically so the Germans could install their own, more powerful influence over the Caribbean, South America, and Pacific Oceanic regions instead. The idea was considered by various junior officers, and different versions of a plan were made, 3 specifically known simply as Plan 1, Plan 2, and Plan 3. But nothing could be solidified, and the scheme was eventually abandoned in 1906 without even a single attempt at execution. Essentially, in the best-case scenario, Germany would have at one point or another expanded its empire across Europe and the surrounding continents. The goal of the Imperial Army was widespread influence and dominion, and had things gone differently in the First World War, it's very possible that the September program would have been only the start of Germany's conquests. Though there was no immediate or clear plan for world domination, Imperial Germany's schemes intending to expand not only through Europe, but in their African colonies as well, was an ambitious aim, and more likely than not would have been step 1, not the final step. Still, European dominion and growing colonies proved possible, but Imperial Germany simply fell short after the failure of the war plan in the West. The German Empire had great potential for gaining more and more influence, and that was even more visible in the Second World War. But during the first one, the imperial power crumbled, and their global dreams shattered with them.